Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patten, and this video will cover the wide receiver position for Week 2 in the NFL. I had originally planned to do a video with wide receiver and the tight end position combined, but I decided that wide receivers need their own video. There's a lot of variance and variables involved from week to week with the wide receivers. And I believe that a lot of the daily fantasy sports contests are won or lost by having or not having the right combination of wide receivers. It's very difficult to get them right, and I believe that the best way that I can describe this is by just taking a look back at week 1 of this season. The top 5 projected wide receivers last week going into the main slate were Evans from Tampa Bay, Jones from Atlanta, Cooks from the Rams, Thielen from Minnesota, and Odell Beckham from Cleveland. Exactly 0 of these wide receivers finished not in the top 5, not in the top 10, not even in the top 20. Julio Jones actually finished best. He finished 21 overall. When you look at the top 5 overall scoring wide receivers from last week, it is somewhat surprising. Number 1 was Sammy Watkins, who had 49.50 points. Jackson from Philadelphia had 38.40 points. Ross from Cincinnati had 37.80 points. Brown from Baltimore had 33.70 points. And Allen from the Chargers had 29.30 points. All but one of these receivers were on the team that was favored. And out of those 4 receivers, all of them had an implied game total between 24 and 27 points. Now, this goes back to the way that I begin building my lineups, and I mentioned it in my previous videos. The very first thing that I do is I look at the Las Vegas lines, and I focus primarily on the game totals. I highlight the teams that have the highest totals, and my thought behind that is that if these games are going to be high scoring, then the players involved in these games are going to be the ones that score the points. That doesn't mean that I rule out all the other games and players in those games, but this is just a starting point for me. And with the wide receiver, the next thing that I look at is the amount of targets that a receiver receives week in and week out, and what that target share is compared to the rest of his team. Another thing that I look at and consider, and I use this oftentimes when I can't decide between 1 or 2 receivers that are closely projected and have similar salaries, is I take into account their actual matchup. Sometimes a player is playing a team has a cornerback that actually matches up well with that wide receiver. And you can also look at things such as previous history against teams if they have the same defensive players. Now, I mentioned targets, and when I'm building my lineups, how I try to focus on targets. For running backs, it's touches. For wide receivers, it's targets. Last week, the top 5 target getters were Crowder from the Jets, who had 17. Fitzgerald from Arizona had 13. Amendola from Detroit had 13. Woods from the Rams had 13. And Kirk from Arizona had 12. Crowder led the way with 14 receptions, but only one of those other 4 receivers actually had an implied total over 25 points, and that was Woods from the Rams. This shows the difficulty in selecting and getting the right combination of wide receivers. But if you can somehow get the right combination, you can set yourself apart from the rest of the field in the daily fantasy sports contest and not only compete or place, but have the potential to take down some of the larger tournaments. I also factor in game script. Teams that are going to be sometimes playing from behind is a good thing to consider. If they're a big underdog, it's not necessary to rule them out, because if they're going to be in comeback mode, sometimes in garbage time they're going to get peppered with a lot of targets on DraftKings. The scoring is PPR, which is a point per reception, and those add up quick. And then if you throw in a touchdown or a broken play at the end of the game for a long touchdown, suddenly you got a 14 or 15 point scoring play, and you put yourself in a good position. In week 2, I have identified the following wide receivers to target, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm targeting them and putting them in the player pool. Number 1 is Adam Thielen from the Minnesota Vikings. I feel that the game script for him, even though the game total is 44.5 points, I feel that the game script might favor Thielen, meaning if Rodgers starts putting up some points against Minnesota, he has historically had really good games against Minnesota. Of course, he plays them a lot because they're in his division. Plays them twice a year. But if Rodgers starts moving the ball up and down the field and putting some points on the board, this is going to take Minnesota away from using Dalvin Cook, and they may have to rely on their passing game, which will involve Thielen. Thielen has a really good rapport with Cousins, and he could definitely rack up some points with the right game script. He only received 3 targets last week, but Minnesota did not put the ball up a lot. And those 3 targets actually represented 30% of the total target share for his team. So even though they didn't pass a lot, he was the one that Cousins was looking to, and he did score a touchdown last week. I also like every one of the Rams receivers, and I'm going to tell you why. In this order, I like Robert Woods first, Cooper Kupp second, and Cooks third. Last year, New Orleans was ranked 31 against quarterbacks, which means the passing game, which involves the wide receivers. Last Monday night, they were tore apart by DeAndre Hopkins and the Houston offense. They won. They did win the game, but it was some last second 58-yard field goal that actually won it for him. But the Houston passing game actually had their way with the with the Saints. And last year the Saints were not that good on pass defense. They're very good on when it comes to defending the run, which forces teams to throw the ball on them. But they and a lot of times they build up big leads, and teams were throwing against them a lot, which would mean that the game script was favoring the teams that they were beating up on pretty good, and they were scoring a lot of points in garbage time. The next target for me is going to be Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals. Last week, Boyd had 11 targets. And with Mixon banged up this week, not really sure if he's going to be even in the game. But if he's not, I think they're definitely going to be trying to rely on the passing game. Bernard is capable of catching some passes out of the backfield, but Andy Dalton does look to Tyler Boyd. I believe this game is going to have some points on the board. The total is actually 45. Cincinnati's a 1-point favorite, so a close game in the 20s. I can see Dalton going to Boyd a lot in this weekend. Like I said, he had 11 targets in the game against Seattle, and I believe Seattle's pass defense may be a little bit better than San Francisco's. Another target of mine this week is going to be Tyrell Williams from Oakland. He is a value pick at $4,400. The game script for this game should be perfect for Carr and Williams to put up some points, as well as perhaps garbage time points. Um, Kansas City coming in is going to be a different opponent than the Denver Broncos, and I see Oakland having to get away from the game script that they had last week, where they were actually able to lean on Josh Jackson. And I believe last week that Williams actually had at $4,400. I'm look here real quick. Tyrell Williams. Yeah, he had seven targets for 105 yards and a touchdown. So Carr was going to him a lot in a game where the game script didn't really favor the passing game. So Tyrell Williams is definitely on my radar. I see him as a value pick, and he will definitely be in the player pool. I also like Edelman from New England. Edelman has historically had some good games against Miami. Um, the game script might not favor Edelman to play the whole game. New England is going into Miami as an 18.5 point favorite. I truly don't remember a time that I've seen a team that was favored by that much, let alone favored by that much on the road. Um, Miami was destroyed last week by Lamar Jackson, and something similar could happen this week. But with that being said, once they get a big enough lead, how much is Edelman even going to be involved in the game plan from there? From moving on. If Miami can somehow keep the game within reason, I could see Edelman getting peppered with a lot of passes. And then again, in building up the lead, that doesn't mean just because a team's going to blow out another team and maybe only play 3 quarters that you don't want to use those players, because to build up that lead, somebody had to score those points. So, and Edelman is definitely Brady's main target. He goes to Edelman a lot out of the slot, and he will get peppered with a lot of passes, whether he plays the whole game or not. I also like Juju Smith-Schuster from Pittsburgh. He should receive a lot of targets against Seattle, who just got torched. I mean, absolutely torched by John Ross from Cincinnati last week. Schuster was kind of quiet in the game against New England Sunday night. They're going back home. I do like quarterbacks in the passing game better when they're at home, and I believe the Seattle's going to obviously try to run the ball and maybe play keep away. But I believe when Pittsburgh has the ball, that Roethlisberger is going to look to Schuster. One thing about Schuster is I believe that he was affected a lot when Antonio Brown was there. A lot of teams schemed their defense towards Brown, and which left Schuster in the open quite a bit. And so he hasn't really proved that he's going to be the guy, but I definitely, I mean, now they have no choice. It's Schuster and the other guy, I believe, is Moncrief. So I see Schuster getting a lot of targets this week. He's not one of the higher priced. Well, he's 7,500, and Hopkins is coming in at 8,100. But I do see him as potentially a receiver who's going to receive a lot of targets. And again, like I said, Cincinnati's Ross just pretty much just single-handedly destroyed the Seattle secondary last weekend. You always have to consider DeAndre Hopkins and Michael Thomas just on their projections of targets alone. They receive a huge volume of targets week in and week out for their teams, and are the focal point of their offenses. Now, I would say this week that Hopkins may have a tougher matchup against Ramsey for the Jaguars. So if I had to choose one or the other, I would probably go with Thomas. He's $100 less, um, and the Rams can be beat in the secondary. That game actually has a total of 50. It's actually the highest total on the board, 52.5 points. So there's going to be some points in that game, and if I, like I said, if I had to pick between Thomas or Hopkins, I would probably lean to Thomas just based on the matchup and the game script. I could see Houston, Jacksonville is going to be coming into Houston um, with that backup quarterback Minshew, and I'm not sure what he didn't do too bad against Kansas City, but Kansas City's defense is not great against the pass. So take that for what it's worth, and we'll see how he does against Houston in Houston. He's going to be on the road in his first start. Finding value at the wide receiver position and trying to fit at least one top wide receiver in my lineup is how I go about building my lineups. And I'll show you after my next show is going to be the tight ends and defense special teams. And then I'm going to do a show where I'm going to combine all the players from the videos that I've done this week, show you the player pool that we have, and build a few lineups with just those players. But I do try to fit one high-priced receiver into my lineup. Now, last week, not fitting any of the high-priced receivers in my lineup wouldn't have worked. I mean, some of them, I told you, they not only did they not finish in the top 20, they were actually Evans finished number 62 overall. Cooks finished number 54 overall. Thielen finished 28th overall, and Beckham finished 26th. So having those top guys last week definitely didn't help, and they were not in the optimal perfect lineups. And the combination that was in optimal definitely did not have high projections. So, like I said, it's very there's a lot of variance involved with it, and if you can narrow it down using targets and matchups and game script, you can get a field of three good receivers. And it doesn't always have to be, like I said, it doesn't always have to be the number one receiver on that team, because if a team such as New England, they focus on taking away something from you. What you do best, they like to take that away from you. If they were playing Atlanta, Belichick would probably be focusing on taking away Julio Jones. So when that happens, you can look at the number two receiver or the slot receiver and factor in the matchups, the individual matchups. This matchup this week for Tyler Boyd, his matchup, he's actually has a 5-inch height difference. That isn't oftentimes the determining factor, but I mean, it certainly helps. He's at home, a 1-point favorite, so close game. Potential to put a lot of points on the board, and he's already right out of the gate. Andy Dalton was peppering Boyd with a lot of targets. So the wide receivers we're going to target this week and put in our player pool are Williams from Oakland, Thielen from Minnesota, all three of the wide receivers from the Rams in this order: Woods, Kupp, and Cooks. Tyler Boyd from Cincinnati, Edelman from New England, Cooper from Dallas, Juju Smith-Schuster from Pittsburgh, Hopkins from Houston, and Thomas from New Orleans. Now, I didn't go into depth about and mention Amari Cooper. Cooper had a absolutely huge game against Washington last year. He should be matched up against Josh Norman. And I'll have to research that. I'm not sure if Norman was actually in that game last year against, but his first game against Washington, he actually went over 200 yards receiving. And he's obviously Prescott's favorite target. Now, with that being said, last week he racked up a lot of points, but Ezekiel Elliott wasn't really involved in the game plan He only carried the ball like 13 times. Moving forward, I can see Zeke having a bigger role in the offense, and actually maybe balancing that out a little bit more with Cooper. Cooper's kind of high up there in price too at 7,400, but the Washington's pass defense is coming in at 2,600. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but if you click on opponent's passing rank uh, in DraftKings, it can give you the reverse order who's going to go on against the worst receivers, or you can click it again and it'll put in order who's going against the best receivers. Number one is on the main slate is John Brown from Buffalo going against the 28th ranked New York Giants pass defense, and they have a price of $5,200 on Brown. This is interesting, and I'm not really sure if you can trust Josh Allen throwing Brown the ball on the road. We're probably going to find out. Um, Dallas did have their way with the Giants last weekend with not just Cooper but Gallup as well. So you also have Cole Beasley, and then there's Juju Smith-Schuster in the next set of games against Pittsburgh. So that's something I didn't know. You can actually sort it by fantasy points per game. You can go over and sort it by the opponent rank, and you can obviously sort it by salary, which is, I guess, what it's set to default to. So I'm going to add these wide receivers to the player pool. My next video is going to cover tight ends and the defense. After we do that video, I'm going to do a combination video, kind of summarize all these players that we've put together this week. And excuse me, moving forward with this, with my channel, you can expect me to do a recap and quarterbacks on Tuesday, Wednesday, and do running backs. Thursday, I'm going to do wide receivers. Friday, I'm going to do tight ends and defense special teams. And then Saturday, put it all together. Another thing we'll be able to do on Saturdays is look at the injury report, factor that in as we move on through the season. Week one didn't really have to worry about it. You pretty much knew who was going to be in the games. But as we move through the season, you're going to have various injuries. And another thing to look at on Saturday is the projected weather. I'm not sure if you all notice this or not, but if you scroll, use the arrows on the games and scroll, the little cloud, sun, dome kind of gives you a basic idea of the weather. Right now, it doesn't really look like there's any weather concerns this weekend. And the first injury, Tyreek Hill's out, obviously. AJ Green's out, and you have Mike Williams from the Chargers is questionable. I had read something about that earlier today. He's actually going to be a game time decision. When I see that, I usually stay away from that. Even if game time decision, even if they're going to be a go, there's nothing saying they go out and they run two plays and then they're out, and then you're stuck with a big fat zero on your score. And when you compete in daily fantasy sports, you don't want to accept a zero in any position. So I'm going to close this video out and start to put together tight ends and defense special teams, and I'll be back soon, and then we'll go and put all this stuff together. If you guys would hit the like button for me, I'd really appreciate it, and subscribe, and I'll see you real soon. Thanks a lot.